17-year-old Julianne Kopecky was flying on Christmas Eve 1971 with her mum and around 90 other passengers when the plane that they were aboard was struck by lightning, and the plane suffered such damage that it crashed. What 17-year-old Julianne remembers was that her seat was thrown far from the plane upon impact. And while still conscious, she remembers looking down at her white dress and her high-heel shoes, and then looking out at the Peruvian jungle and noticing that the trees kind of looked like cauliflower and broccoli before she passed out. When she regained consciousness, it was pouring rain. She realized that she was still strapped into her airline seat, and so she unbuckled herself and hid under the seat just to protect her from the rain, which lasted for the whole day. When it stopped raining, she was looking around and trying to figure out, like, where am I? I don't even know what country I'm in. And I don't even know whether anyone else survived. I'm here on my own. I'm looking around, and she's just looking, and she can see the jungle canopy that was all closed in. Barely streams of light coming through. And she said, there's no way anyone is going to see me. No planes flying overhead are ever going to see me here. And are they even going to think that I'm still alive? So she had a little decision to make. In the middle of that really difficult, extraordinary experience, she looked around and decided, look, I don't know too much about where I am or what's going to happen. But she remembered that her father had once said two things about this country and other countries, is that if you find water, you find civilization. And so she thought, right, there's these two guiding principles that if I just go down here, I'll find water, and then that water will lead me to people. So she just trekked away and just went downhill and eventually found water, but that river kept winding, and after 11 days, she walked out of that jungle and into civilization. What she found out later, that there were about another dozen people who also survived the impact of the plane crash, were thrown out from the wreckage, but they didn't move. They stayed in that place, and they actually all died there. And in any difficult situation, fear can overwhelm us, and to a point where it can paralyze us from moving forward. But little 17-year-old Julianne lived. How did she do it? Well, in the middle of an extremely difficult moment, she had guiding principles to help her navigate. And you don't need me to tell you that we're in extremely disorientating times. And it's not so much where are we headed, we kind of all know where this is heading to, but it's about how do we navigate through it? How do we navigate through? Because it's hard to see goodness and light when we're shrouded in darkness. And I want to suggest to us that in the same way, Julianne had guiding principles to help her navigate through her darkness, that we too can find some navigating principles as well. And there are principles from our Heavenly Father that I believe that can lead us safely home. And these principles are displayed by Daniel, but they're also found in Jesus, who came from the Father. Listen to how John describes these principles of Jesus. It says in John chapter 1 that the Word, which is Jesus, became flesh. He made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. And today I want to talk about these two guiding principles with us this morning, the principles of truth and grace, that we can stand firm and at the same time be gracious to those around us who may even oppose us. But let me welcome you to Lifeway, and if we haven't met, my name's Rob. I'm one of the pastors here. We've been in this series on the book of Daniel. And we've titled it Resolve because Daniel resolved to stand firm and love well no matter what opposition was coming against him. And the whole point of this series, if you haven't got it by now, and if this is your first week, then we've uploaded them onto our YouTube channel so you can go and have a look at that. But if you haven't got the point by now, it's this. Just listen to this and you can go home. It's that culture's shifting. And it's shifting further and further away from God. And we're kind of going to get caught in the crosshairs of all of that. How are we going to respond is so important. And my advice, and I think what the Bible tells us, and what we see in Daniel, is that there is a way to be able to stand firm and love well, no matter what's going on around us, even to those people who are hostile towards us. And we've got to figure out how we're going to navigate through this godless culture that we find ourselves in, how we're going to live through the tension of wanting to live godly lives and live to the biblical standards that, and without alienating people around us, those people that don't share the same faith as us. Because in reality, they need God just as much as we do. And so these important principles of truth and grace are extremely important, but it's a problem. And here's the problem. We are the problem. We are the problem. Because we either go in hard with the truth at the expense of grace, or we go in all grace at the expense of truth. And I don't know about whether this kind of relates to anyone here, but I think as a sweeping generalization, people can be divided into two categories. There can be truth tellers and grace givers. Are you the type of person known for being direct, blunt, honest, straight down the line, call a spade, a truth teller? Or are you the type of person that, just avoids the truth a little bit, you don't want to upset anyone, you want to come in all nice, say nothing, you don't want to appear mean or confrontational, so you give lots of grace instead. Where do the scales tip for you? If you came here with somebody this morning, maybe you want to turn and ask them which side of the scales they think you fall on. Go on, do it now. If you're with someone, tell them, am I a truth teller or am I a grace giver? Now, the truth tellers, here's the thing. Don't get into a confrontation right now because, you're going to defeat the whole purpose. The truth tellers will be chomping at the bit to tell you what they think you are. The grace givers, they don't want to play. Just leave me out of it. But I wonder where the scales tip for you. And if you're not sure what side of the scales you kind of tend to lean, I've got a little quiz that might help you out. So Foxy's going to bring that up. Which side of the scales? Here's the first question that I've got for you. A neighbour's dog is barking continuously in the early hours of the morning. Do you, A, anonymously call the council and make an official complaint? Do you, B, tell your neighbours that if they don't shut that dog up, you most certainly will? Or do you, C, obtain a quote for double glazed windows and buy several roosters with a chicken coop alongside your neighbour's fence? Or D, invite your neighbours over for afternoon tea and raise the issue in the kindest way possible? A, B, C, or D? A, B, C, D's? Now the truth comes out. I love it. Okay, some of you haven't put up your hand yet, so this next question might be for you. You're talking to a friend, and as they're speaking, a little bit of spit comes out of their mouth and lands on your face. Do you, A, wipe it away immediately and tell them, say it, don't spray it? Or do you, B, pretend nothing at all happened and just continue the conversation? That'd just look funny, wouldn't it? But anyway. Acknowledge, C, acknowledge with a laugh and tell them, well, you didn't shower this morning anyway. Or D, grab the nearest umbrella as a subtle indication of your love and determination to continue the conversation. Okay, where do you fall? A, B, C, or D? One more. This one's an easy one. your spouse asks you, do these jeans make me look fat? You say, A, yeah, those jeans are just not working for you. B, not at all. I like how your legs fill them out like that. Or C, are you kidding? You're not fat. When did I say you're fat? You know, you get all defensive. Yeah, we've all been there. Or D, honey, I'm probably not the best person to ask because I think you look great in everything you wear. And all the men said D, right? Yeah. Definitely. So where do the scales tip for you? Truth teller or grace giver? It's critical that we respond the right way because truth without grace is mean and grace without truth is just meaningless. And here's my point. If we offend everyone, we're probably emphasizing truth at the expense of grace, and if we offend no one, then we're likely watering down the truth just in the name of grace, and it's critical that we always respond the right way. I heard about a church in the US that decided to make a very public stand on the abortion issue. They came out and said, look, we are pro-life, we're making a decision, we want everybody to know that this is where our church stands. Well, their church copped a lot of criticism, and the following week they found out that there was a pro-choice group that was going to come to their church and protest out the front of their church. This church, they heard about the pro-choicers coming to their church, so they said, okay, we're going to respond in an appropriate way. So they set up a table alongside them where they knew that they were going to be protesting, and they set up a coffee cart and gave them coffee and donuts all day. And said, look, we might disagree on the issue, but we can have a civil conversation about it. And that's what they did. Now, they weren't the only ones there because another pro-life group heard that the pro-choicers were coming to protest at this church, and they decided to go on the other side of the table to protest against the pro-choicers. So you have a church that was holding their services, and out the front you have a protesting group of pro-choice. They were for the issue of abortion. There was a church serving tea and coffee, and then there was another group over here who were all pro-life. And then what happened was that this group of pro-lifers started brawling with the pro-choicers, and they started arguing, and it started to get very, very uncomfortable. And so the pastor came out, and he asked one of them to leave, and he asked the pro-lifers to leave. The next week, after all the dust settled, more pro-lifers came back and protested against the church for being too soft, being too gracious. And it just, isn't that just chaotic? Like, does that just do your head in? I don't know. How do we love well and stand firm at the same time? That's the question. And that's the question that we face in a world that's becoming more hostile towards Christian values. When we leave here, we can't just go around and wave a banner that says, hey, we're pro this or pro that, or we're Christian this or we're Christian that, because there's a world out there that's completely hostile against what we believe as Christians. And we live now in what's called a cancel culture, where they're looking to cancel us. And the Essendon Bombers know this issue very, very well. But I'll show you a couple of examples in Daniel. And Daniel leads us through, and I think provides to us a real example of how to administer this grace and truth scenario. See, Daniel was in Babylon. It was a godless place. It worshipped anything and everything. And they were living in spiritual darkness, and they needed to hear the truth. But not only that, you've got to remember that Daniel was brought into Babylon as a teenage boy. He would have seen some horrific things that occurred back home in Israel. He was separated from his family. He probably seen some of them killed. He was exiled from his country, brought to a foreign land with a different way of life, a different language. Yeah, he had his own name changed, and he would have also undergone surgery which made him into a eunuch. terribly disorientating for an adult, let alone a teenage boy. And while Daniel had every reason to be withdrawn, resentful, even hostile, we see him act with grace, kindness, against those who could be seen as his enemies, while they certainly opposed what he stood for. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples. And the first one I'm going to show you is in chapter 1 with the chief official. His name was Ashpenaz. And Ashpenaz was basically put in charge over all the boys that were brought into the palace. They were going to get trained up in the ways of the palace so they could become advisors to the king. And Ashpenaz was kind of in charge of this program of indoctrinating them to the Babylonian culture. And it was in the early stages, and this would have been completely overwhelming for someone like Daniel, because whenever you face any kind of trial or pressure or adversity, you know, what's within you often comes to the surface, right? When you get squeezed, it's often what's deepest within you sort of comes out. You know, you're not going to squeeze a lemon and get pineapple juice. You know, so what we talked about last week was the fact that Daniel was prepared. He had excellent character. He had an excellent spirit. We talked about this last week, where this was being formed in him way before he even got to Babylon. And so what we see is the true character of any person when they're under pressure rises to the surface. And that's what we see with Daniel. So Ashpenaz, in chapter 1, verse 6, he, Ashpenaz, was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians, and the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, there were certain foods that the God of the Bible had asked his people not to eat, but now it was being served up to Daniel and others. And so, how does Daniel stand firm in his convictions? Well, we read on in verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. My question is why did he ask permission when he had already resolved not to eat the food? Daniel must have played out various scenarios in his mind, considering all his options. And really, there are only two options he was faced with. He could eat the food that was generally offered to as a sacrifice to idols and other gods, and it was forbidden by the God of the Bible. He could have gone down that and just eaten the food, or he could have just refused, knowing that this guy that's in charge had the resources to actually imprison him, put him to death, solve the problem once and for all, if you like, you know. And with those two options on the table, the choice was obvious for Daniel. He was resolved. And so he had already made that decision that he'd rather please God than please the king. He chose the truth of his convictions, and that's what he did. So Daniel didn't just consider the cost to himself, however. So he's weighing this up. He considered the cost to Ashpenaz as well, which I think is really quite remarkable. Ashpenaz would have been punished had Daniel and others not eaten the food and appeared unhealthy. Have a look at verse 10. But the official, this is Ashpenaz, told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel wants to reassure Ashpenaz. And again, Daniel seems to operate at a level of grace. This is unmerited favor towards Ashpenaz. And so he says, test me for 10 days, giving us only vegetables. And then you decide, Ashpenaz, you decide what to do. How does he do this? Well, he gets given just vegetables and water for 10 days. And Daniel and some other of the Hebrew boys, they come out stronger and healthier looking than all the other men, young boys who were eating from the king's table. And so Ashpenaz then continues to give them the food that was appropriate because of their religious convictions. God's favor was on Daniel, and he caused the officials to treat Daniel well. So then Daniel operated in truth because he was resolved, but he also operated with grace. he was looking out for Ashpenaz. He understood Ashpenaz's predicament and was looking to try to soften some of that. So that's the first example. Here's the second. There's other examples. I'll just pick out two this morning. Here's another example from chapter 4. If you remember, the king has a weirdo dream. And in the dream, he starts thinking about what's going on in his life. And you've got to think about this because who is Nebuchadnezzar to Daniel? Like, he's evil. Like, he just represents pure evil. Nebuchadnezzar was the one that we saw just last week cast Daniel's 3 friends into the fiery furnace because they wouldn't bow down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar had erected and asked people to fall down and worship. So here's what's going on. Nebuchadnezzar stands for so much that violates what Daniel believes in. I mean, if you think about it, if there was ever a person that Daniel has a right to hate and despise, it's Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel has, in this moment where he is being called upon to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream, he is now placed with such incredible power because Nebuchadnezzar really is at his mercy and how the tables have turned. Daniel has the opportunity to exalt himself. He has the opportunity to get revenge. He has the opportunity to demand a large payment for his interpretation. But he doesn't do any of that. And I think it's so convicting and powerful. Listen to how Daniel responds to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 19 of chapter 4. Upon hearing this, Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, was overcome for a time, frightened by the meaning of the dream. Not because of fear that he would be punished, he was overwhelmed with compassion for the king. Because listen to what it says next. Belteshazzar answered, "My lord, if only the dream and its meaning had to do with those who hate you and fight against you." In other words, Daniel is showing compassion towards the king. There is genuine sorrow in Daniel's heart when he realizes what God is saying is going to happen to the king. He was showing grace. Now, I'm sure that Daniel must have wondered whether he would continue to go ahead with the truth part. But Daniel is a stand-up guy, and he has a speak-up moment. And not many people will stand up and hold on to their convictions when the pressure's on, but Daniel does. And so what does he say? He says, "King, I really wish I had better news for you, but this doesn't look good." And then Daniel lays it out. He interprets the king's dream and says, "King, there's a tree, and that tree represents you and all your splendor, all your glory. But with all the responsibilities that you have and all the power at your hand, you've just become proud and arrogant. And so God's saying, I'm going to cut you down. That tree, Nebuchadnezzar, is you. Your greatness, your strength, your power has grown. And as a result, that's made you so proud, so arrogant. And you think of yourself more highly than you ought. You've set yourself up above everything. You think that you're the reason that you're having all this success. You haven't realized that the God of heaven is the one that controls these things, who actually made you prosperous. And you have not humbled yourself because you think that you're responsible for all this. And God is going to cut you down. And what we see is that Daniel has the courage to do something that literally risks his life. He speaks the truth. Not because he was proud himself, not because he was arrogant and wanted to correct the king or rub the king's face in it or anything like that. He speaks the truth because he cared for the king. He was worried for the king. And he goes on to say, God's not finished with you yet. Daniel gives the truth. And then in verse 27, Daniel takes it a step further. He says, therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed, and then may your prosperity continue. You see, Daniel was moved with compassion. He had an opportunity to extend grace, and he did. But he also stayed firm and then continued to let Nebuchadnezzar know the truth. You know, we're called to love people, whether we agree with them or not. And at any moment, any person can come through these doors. And we are to welcome them. We are invited to sit down, let them sit with us. And it's not our job to tell them what to think or what to believe. That's God's job. We are to love them. And if we're invited to tell them the truth. But it's not the truth at the expense of grace. And it's not just, hey, come in and do whatever you want at the expense of truth either. We've got to get this right. Because this is the responsibility of every Christian. This is the responsibility of a church. To be light in the darkness. Truth without grace destroys people, and grace without truth just deceives people. Sometimes in order to stand up for God, we have to speak up to others, but it's to be done with grace and truth together. And sometimes, they're going to listen to you, and sometimes they're not. But here's what I want you to listen to today and get today is that you're not responsible for how they respond to what you say. We're responsible for how we treat others. We're not responsible for how they respond. Now, I wish I could stand here and tell you that I get this right every time, but I can't. In fact, I remember I was in Anglesey one weekend, and I was buying some exotic timber from a guy that imported French timber, and he was really quite chatty, telling me about the timber, telling me about how he obtained it, and his whole journey. And he's quite an expressive guy, and his language was quite colourful. And the guy asked me what I did for a living, and I said, "Look, I told him, and the first words that came out of his mouth after that was, "I'll be damned." And I went, "Look, we can talk about that if you want." And he's gone, no, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant. And then he just began as if it was some confessional time to talk to me and justify the reasons why he's like he is. And as he talked to me, it became clear that he believed in a 51% gospel. That if I do enough just to get over, 50%, like if Jesus is, 100% and Hitler's 0, I just got to be kind of on this side of, of the scale, and I'll be right. And he said, "Look, I'll just keep doing my good deeds each day, and I'll be fine." And I just sort of laughed and said, "Yeah, good deeds are good," thinking that the Bible says even my righteous works are like filthy rags to God. And I thought that. But I went, I'm not going to say it, I don't want to have that, he's just about to give me a discount and everything, I don't want to just jeopardize that. So I disagreed with him, and I didn't speak up, and I didn't do what I wanted to do. I just kind of agreed and said, "Yeah, look, the world would be a better place if you just did your good deeds." And I wish I could tell you that I spoke up and shared the gospel, but I didn't. He needed to hear the truth, and I regretted telling him. I was all grace and zero truth that day. And it wasn't long after this that I remember I was in a hurry. I had a meeting here in Lara, but I was missing something. It might have been an electrical cord, so I thought, right, I'll just duck into Bunnings. And so I just jumped in the car and just went out to Bunnings. And I thought, look, I've just got just enough time to get out to Bunnings and then get back for my meeting. And so I get out to Bunnings and just thinking, right, where do I go to find this place? And there's a young guy standing there on a broom, and he says, "Mate, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, look, I'm looking for," I can't even remember what it was, such and such. And he said, and I just wanted him to tell me what aisle it's in. I'll just go there and get it. And he said, no, you just follow me. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll follow you. And he's walking so slow. He's got his broom and he's talking to some of the other staff members on the way. And I'm like just going, I'm trying to walk ahead of him, but I don't know where he's going, so that's a bit of pointless. And then he's talking to me along the way. He's going, oh, is it still raining outside? And I'm like, yep. And he's going, is it going to be raining tomorrow, I wonder? Probably. Like, I'm giving him nothing. I'm just going, look, we've just got, just take me, just hurry, just get me to the island so I can get the thing. And he's just taking his time, and I'm getting frustrated. And, he's like, how's your day been? I'm going, yeah, look, it's great. And he said, look, are you a tradie? And I said, nah. And I went, oh, hang on. I know where this is going. I know what the next question is going to be. And look, I wasn't rude to him, but I was probably a little bit short. And so he said, well, what do you do, mate? I said, well, I kind of like work for an organisation of people, and, I talk to a lot of people, I kind of help people. And so he wants it. And I said, look, I'm a pastor of a church. And like then it was on like Donkey Kong. Like he's going like, what church is it? Where is it? How many people go? Are there any hot chicks there? Like he's just rattling off all these questions after question. And I'm going, right, I'm going to be late. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to make this worth it. And so I said, so tell me, where are you at with Jesus? Because we're all sinners. I start going for the job. We all need Jesus. I was on a mission to make this guy regret that he was having this conversation with me. I was hitting with him. I just hit him with the truth. And then I see him, and then in that moment I kind of recognize he's just a young boy, And he's looking at me all confused, like going, like, who are you? Like, what are you doing to me? And then in that moment my heart softens towards him, and I see this young guy as someone that Jesus loves and that Jesus wants me to love. And I end up praying for him right then and there in the store. It was a quick prayer, I'll admit, but I prayed for him and I invited him to church. I wasn't responsible for whether he came to church, but I was responsible of being truthful, but I was also a little bit irresponsible and not probably as gracious as I could have been. And I remember those two instances and wanted to tell you because I feel like it's important that we all recognize that it's sometimes not easy, and there are going to be times when we're called to extend truth and grace to people out there, and we're not always going to get it right, but we must try. And it always reminds me of this story in the Bible. It's found in John 8, and you're probably really familiar with it. Even people who haven't been to church very regularly kind of know one of the lines in this story. It's where the teachers of the religious law and Pharisees bring a certain type of woman to Jesus. And what the text says is that they put her in front of the crowd, making a spectacle of her, and they said to Jesus, we caught her. And this is what the Bible says, truth. But we want to know how you're going to respond, Jesus. What do you say? And isn't that the tension right now? That on social issues, political issues, you walk out and you might be in the marketplace or the workplace or wherever you might find yourself this week, and if a certain issue comes up, they want to know, where do you stand on this issue? What's your point of view? What's your opinion? And that's the tension that we face. And what are we going to say when the whole world wants to know what we think, what we're going to do about it? Which way are you going to lean? What do you think, Jesus? And they're doing this to try to trap Jesus, of course, because they wanting to cancel him. And so they're basically saying, giving Jesus an either-or scenario. Either you're going to go to the truth and condemn her for what she's done, or you're going to go soft on her, Jesus, like you have with other sinners and other people that you you fellowship with and you have dinner with and spend time with. And which one is it going to be, Jesus? Are you going to deny the truth and just extend grace, or are you going to be grace and deny what the Bible says and show that you're really not the man of God that everyone is saying? Pick one, Jesus. What's it going to be? And it goes on to say in verse 6 that they were using this question to trap Jesus in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up. I love that. I just love that picture that Jesus has straightened up. Back straight, shoulders back, looking them in the eye. And when they kept questioning, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her." And again, he stooped down and he began to write on the ground. We don't know what he wrote on the ground. But there's an interesting thing that happened. It says that while he was doing this, that one by one at a time, starting with the oldest to the youngest, until Jesus was left alone, each one left, dropping their stones, until it was just Jesus and the woman alone. Let me just say this. Whenever Jesus confronts us with our sin and with our past, he's not looking to poke a finger in your chest, going, "I know everything about you and I know what you did." Even though he does. He doesn't do it in a humiliating way. He does it with such love and grace, kindness and respect, a real personal kind of way. And it's demonstrated here in verse 10 because Jesus straightened up and he just didn't just confront the accusers, he confronts the woman now. And it says that Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Where are they? Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." And I'm sure many people who were following Jesus probably may have walked away somewhat disgusted with Jesus for being so tolerant of her. But Jesus wasn't tolerant. He was just respectful. He was just gracious. He still looked at her in her eyes and told her plainly, "Stop sinning." Grace invites you to come. You're still welcome to come, but Jesus says, let's face this truth together. Let's face it together. We can do this, and I can help you to overcome your life of sin. And today, I want to call us and our church to hold high God's truth, to not buckle under pressure. We're not changing the Bible because culture is putting pressure on us. We're not changing God's truth because other people are uncomfortable with it. We hold to God's truth. We hold to the biblical understanding of what life and life is all about, according to God. But we just do it in a way that's kind and respectful to those who oppose it, are hostile towards us, and might be putting pressure on us in exactly the same way that they did to Daniel and they did to Jesus. That's our mandate, to operate in truth and grace.